Hello guys, and welcome to my build of the Tamiya Brewster Buffalo Pacific Theatre version in 1/48 scale. As you can see, this is an RAF version of the Buffalo, and originally I thought this was a rebox of the 1993 Tamiya release of the US version. But according to ScaleMates, it turns out that that itself was a reboxing of what was originally an RAF version of this kit in 1974. So it is quite an old boxing. Now, the Buffalo itself is not a particularly well-known aircraft. It was an American design, introduced in 1939, but by the time that America entered the war in 1941, it was already essentially obsolete. Buffaloes were used by the US Marine Corps at the Battle of Midway, where they were massively outclassed by the Japanese Zeros. And after that time, the Buffaloes were essentially relegated to a training role. On the other hand, Buffaloes were used by the Finnish Air Force during the Continuation War with Russia, and they gave a much better account of themselves there, being able to take on many of the Russian aircraft of the time. The British, being short of many things, took on Buffaloes in 1940 as part of the Far East Command, and they were sent to Singapore and Malaya to defend their holdings there. And of course it's the RAF in the Far East that are represented in this boxing. The RAF Buffaloes had been altered from the original order and included a less powerful engine, which of course hampered performance even more. Nevertheless, there was some initial success against the Japanese aircraft, especially the earlier types such as the Nate, but the later Ki-43 Oscar aircraft proved to be too much for the Buffaloes. Various tactics were tried, including reducing fuel and ammunition loads to reduce weight and improve manoeuvrability, but ultimately it was a losing battle. Any remaining Buffaloes were flown to the Dutch East Indies for the defence of that island before Singapore fell on the 10th of February 1942. In terms of the model kit, I think I'll start by showing you the instructions because we have a number of interesting schemes. The first scheme, Scheme A, is on a separate sheet of paper for some reason, and this is number 448 Squadron, Royal New Zealand Air Force, Singapore, late 1941. And you can see there we've got the standard dark earth and dark green camouflage scheme with some interesting nose art that looks like kind of like a sort of a dragon or something there. Scheme B is number 67 RAF Squadron, Burma, late 1941. And when you look at the underside of this, you can see that it's got the right starboard wing in sky and the port wing in black. And in fact, if we look back at Scheme A, for some reason Scheme A doesn't show us an underside shot, but that also has that split underside colour as well. You can see it on the side profiles there. C is a very different scheme. This is the Netherlands East Indies Army Air Corps, Batavia, Java Island, 1942. Now, Java fell to the Japanese on the 12th of March 1942, so this is literally weeks before the fall of that island. A couple of things to note on this scheme. First of all, we've got the orange triangular national insignia, which are quite interesting. And then secondly, you can't tell on the black and white image, but although we've got the standard sort of camouflage pattern, the colours are different. We've got XF49 for the sort of the browny colour, which is khaki, Tamiya khaki. And then we've got XF62 for the green colour, which is a sort of olive drab colour. So that's a very interesting scheme to consider. Finally, we have a US Navy scheme. This is aboard the USS Long Island in 1941, and this is overall light grey. So 4 interesting schemes there. You do need to choose which one you want before you get too far in, because even step 1 of the instructions requires different parts for different options. As you can see here from the seat design and the presence or absence of the armour. I went for option A, which is the Royal New Zealand Air Force scheme. I do tend to do aircraft in RAF or Commonwealth markings if I can. So I started by building up that cockpit. The Buffalo has an interesting feature, which is a window in the floor of the aircraft, which I'll show you more of later on. You can see that despite the relatively old moulds, 1974 as I said, we still do have quite a lot of detail in the cockpit. At this stage I was ignoring any of the colour callouts in the instructions and just building things up. And what I typically like to do is get the seat in one side of the cockpit half first. I find that gives a nice balance between solid construction and ease of access for painting. We have this small box which essentially becomes the floor of the cockpit and has the rudder pedals on it. And at this point, quite early in the build, I was able to put the wing tops onto the lower wings. And so here you can see both the window in the bottom of the fuselage there and that floor of the cockpit with the rudder pedals on them. And the way there that the seat is suspended above those. Overall this was quite a quick process. It took me just an hour or so to get the main sub-assemblies built, with the cockpit built up and the wings in place. Now there are lots of debates about the correct colours for aircraft cockpits, and that seems to be particularly the case when you've got the RAF using American fighters like this. I'm fully aware there's lots of options. They could be bare metal, they could have been repainted in RAF interior green, they could have been in zinc chromate primer, they could have been in US interior green, they could be something that no one's thought of. Personally, I'm not somebody who likes to look at black and white photos and try to interpret colours, so I had to think about it for a bit. I looked at my tin of AK Real Colours zinc chromate, which I haven't used much. I painted all of the interior parts with zinc chromate, so the wheel wells, all of the cockpit areas, and then I went for just the pilot's immediate surroundings in my mix of US interior green. And for that I basically followed the Tamiya instructions, which is XF5 and XF3, green and yellow, with a ratio of 2:1. And I'm happy with that. In reality, of course, much of the yellow won't be visible, but there will be a little bit at the bottom. Any of the detail painting in the cockpit was done using Vallejo model colours. I did sponge on a little bit of aluminium to give some chipping and some wear effects. And then very quickly I feel like I had a pretty respectable Buffalo cockpit. And because of the nature of the breakdown of the parts, I figured that while I was putting the fuselage halves together, it made sense to put the fuselage into the wings as well, and to tape the front cowling into place. And hopefully that will make sure that everything is nice and aligned and where it should be. After that, believe it or not, there's not a huge amount of assembly to do. The undercarriage legs are in one component, or at least one piece for the main structural aspect, which means they're nice and strong. We have two very slightly different rears to the fuselage depending on which version we're building. And we have a fairly standard propeller assembly. The kit does give us two figures. The seated one is for the US Air Force, while the standing one is for the RAF and Commonwealth Air Forces. I was going to include the figure, but somewhere after putting a base coat of paint on him, I managed to lose him. Then it was straight to painting, and I've skipped ahead slightly here. So I gave everything a coat of Tamiya primer, then a base coat of XF69 NATO black. I've then painted the starboard underside in sky, and I've started to put on the camouflage scheme using RAF Dark Earth on the upper side. and the sky and the dark earth are both AK real colours. Again, I know there's some discussion about whether or not the dark earth and the dark green were the same on US supplied aircraft as on British made aircraft, but I decided simply to use the British colours anyway. One handy thing about the sheet with the paint scheme is that it's a 1:1 scale, so it's exactly the right size for the Buffalo, and that means that I can take some Tamiya masking sheet like this and use it to roughly follow the pattern on the diagram. I love Tamiya masking sheet for this purpose. I think it's much easier to use than using masking tape. You can cut it to shape like so and then just cover the appropriate areas. And you can see when I've airbrushed the brown, I've deliberately gone slightly further than I should do because that can easily be covered with the green. Here we are ready to take on the RAF dark green. Handily, Tamiya also give us some masks both for the main canopy glass and for that window that goes on the underside of the fuselage, which is really helpful because there's a lot of framework here and a lot of glass. Here's our aircraft with the green applied, and if we remove the masking tape, I think you'll agree that looks pretty decent. So the final colour that I need to apply here is the black to the port side. The black you can see here at the moment is just the base coat. And of course we've got a sky identification ring that needs to go there too. The black I used was a 50-50 mix of XF1 black and XF69 NATO black. And as I'm pulling the masking tape off here, I realise that I forgot to do the black walkway panels there. I masked them off, but I simply forgot to airbrush them. Decals for those are supplied in the kit, but I think they look a lot better painted. Here you can see I've painted rather than use the decal for the ID stripe. And again, that's AK Real Colours Sky. The engine was painted black and then given a quite heavy dry brush of a metallic steel colour, I think this was, including with a thinner brush there to get all those details. VMS gloss varnish was used to provide a nice smooth surface for the decals. I tend to only apply it where the decals will go, but on an aircraft this size that tends to be most places. The instructions say that the A scheme that I'm doing has the same underside decals as the B scheme, and you can note here we've got two different types of roundels, one on each wing. A lot of people say that Tamiya decals are quite thick, but I found these went down perfectly well. I do want to use my Cricut machine, which I bought recently, to make masks for roundels in the future, but for this I decided to go straight for the decals. Once the decals were applied, and there aren't that many of them, there were no stencil decals in this kit, they were left to dry overnight, and then the final additions were made. We've got a pair of bombs, one on each wing, a metal frame behind the pilot, and a few of the pitot tubes and aerials. When the glue on all of that was dry and before the clear parts were in place, I used VMS matte varnish to give everything a nice matte coat. I really do like this varnish. I think models look fantastic after an application of this. And then finally, because I do tend to like my aircraft models to be quite clean, I gave a very light pin wash using Abteilung 502 sepia oil paint, thinned with odourless thinner. Being quite an old kit, some of these panel lines are raised and some of them are recessed, so it does make the process slightly more challenging, but of course you can always clean up any mess with a bit of odourless thinner. And with that done, my model was complete. Before we have a look at it, let's have a look at the real thing at RAF Kallang in Singapore in 1941. And there we go guys, that was my build of the Tamiya Brewster Buffalo in the markings of Royal New Zealand Air Force 488 Squadron in Singapore in 1941. Overall this was quite a quick build for me, taking just about a week to build and paint. And to be honest, although it's quite an old kit, I wouldn't have guessed that from the construction process. It was all pretty straightforward. Maybe some of those raised panel lines are a bit of an indication of the age of the kit, but everything else was decent indeed. I do like RAF aircraft, and there's quite a few of them from the Second World War which were a bit like the Buffalo, obsolete before they were even put into service, or had some interesting quirks and other things. I've still got many aircraft in the stash, and I'm trying not to buy any more kits, trying being the operative word, until I can work my way through it a bit more. And of course I'll have lots of build videos coming up in the future. I would like to say thank you to all of you for watching, and extra special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Your support is hugely appreciated guys. I really appreciate the discussions and the feedback and the comments that we have on the Patreon and YouTube platforms, and it really does help drive and change the direction of my modelling, so thank you hugely for that. I will be back next week with a tank video for you, and I won't tell you what it is, but it's not going to be World War II. So until then, thank you again for watching, and have fun modelling.